Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teaching with Magic, a podcast exploring the intersection of education, fantasy, and literacy. Here at Teaching with Magic, we explore the different ways that teachers in the fiction and in the real world make magic for their students. You'll hear discussions about teachers and teaching methods in fantasy, science fiction, and pop culture. You'll hear interviews with scholars in various fields about important topics in education, and you'll get to be a part of an ongoing conversation about why the imagination matters. Welcome to Teaching with Magic. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Teaching with Magic. I'm your host, Elise Trudel-Cedeno. I'm so excited to introduce you to our next guest, our next teacher with magic. I want to introduce you to Dr. Luke Shelton. Luke Shelton holds a PhD from the University of Glasgow's Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic. His dissertation, Small Hands Do Them Because They Must, focuses on the reception of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings by young readers. Currently, Luke serves as the editor-in-chief for Malorn, a journal of the Tolkien Society. He is also the creator and co-host of the Tolkien Experience podcast with Sarah J. Westvick and Dr. Sarah Brown. You can find out more about the Tolkien Experience Project, Luke's PhD, and other publications at luke-shelton.com. Friends, when I first heard that Luke Shelton had published his dissertation on young readers' interpretations of The Lord of the Rings, I knew I had to talk to him. I knew I had to find out how he came to his conclusions, the study, and his experience in working with young readers and how they interpret, how they process, how they think about fantasy, and how they think about their own reading. This was such a wonderful conversation, and Luke and I share a lot of the same, educational philosophies. We share a lot of the same opinions about education and about reading. And I cannot even tell you how wonderful this conversation is. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation between myself and Dr. Luke Shelton. Okay, so love to get right into it. Dr. Luke Shelton. So do you still teach now, correct? Are you still tutoring? Are you teaching in a classroom? And what subjects do you teach?
So currently I teach at a learning center where I live, and really that's a lot of one-on-one education. I do a lot of work with students for standardized testing, but also I do a lot of subject tutoring, and there are some students who come in who are more advanced for their age, and so we actually write curriculum specifically for them to kind of challenge them more than maybe their school is at the moment. So really that's where I get to kind of flex the literature a bit more when we're developing curriculum and reading things with the student that aren't assigned by other people.
So very individualized, this is to challenge them in a space that they might not, in a way that they might not get at their own schooling.
Right, exactly. And really we see that as a supplement because, having been a public school teacher, I know how much work they have to do just to meet the needs of all their students within their regular curriculum. So we like to think we're kind of coming online beside them to help kind of those high achieving students who need more get more without having to overburden the teacher.
That's wonderful. Because we all know teachers, they have plenty to do throughout from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. every day. So that's great.
And beyond.
And beyond, yes. Which fantasy pop culture stories have you been able to use in this individual curriculum? What have you explored with your students?
So it really depends on the students, but I think my favorites have been Tolkien. I've been able to use The Lord of the Rings a couple times. And then also I've been able to use a couple other fantasy works, but right now, particularly, we're using some more realistic fiction, like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which I'm working through with 2 students right now. But personally, my favorites are those fantasy works when we can bring them in, especially Tolkien.
Oh, yes. Oh goodness. Do you find that the fantasy content are there gaps that you need to bridge that you can use, especially you mentioned the testing parts, if you're doing test prep, are you able to use that fantasy content to help them with their understanding of this other kind of text that they have to read?
Yeah. So in one sense, we don't really have to, because on most standardized tests, there is a literature component. So we can use fantasy in its own right as literature to develop those skills for, detecting themes, identifying motifs, character motivations, point of view, all those kinds of things, which, fits right at home with fantasy literature. We don't have to adapt it at all. But we can also use fantasy literature to hone some of the more general skills that they would need for reading things like science passages or nonfiction, where we're teaching them to, identify inferences that they can make, summarize main ideas for certain paragraphs or passages, as well as looking for individual facts, data, information. It's all pretty dry stuff. So if you can take it and apply it to a text that's not quite as dry as, say, like a lab report or something like that, sometimes it helps them maintain the motivation a little bit better to just practice the skills. And then later on, we'll actually use it on the texts that they are applying it to in the actual test.
Yeah. I think I found recently that I was going through the appendices with some students, and that's some pretty dry stuff too. And they're thinking to themselves, wait a second, this is Tolkien. Tolkien's fun. I like Tolkien. How come this stuff is dry? And I said, it's a history textbook. The appendices are a history textbook. Yeah. And it's, all the graphs, all the charts. And it really is fascinating to take a look at these two really disparate subjects and try and bring them together.
Yeah, and depending on what appendice you're reading, sometimes it's a linguistic book.
Oh yes, they loved Appendix F. Yeah, they loved Appendix F. They found it so fascinating, and I told them all these things about writing systems and how they work, and they ate it up. It was great.
I love this is with kind of older elementary, younger middle schoolers, the whole give them the Hobbit and have them translate the runes on the text and all that kind of stuff. That's always fun.
It's the best. It's the best. And when they realized that was a real writing system that was used once upon a time ago, they're like, wait, this is a real life thing. This is awesome. Like, I have a student who literally writes in Hobbit runes to her dad. She writes letters to her dad in Hobbit runes. It's great.
Oh, that's sweet.
It is. It's wonderful. So why Tolkien? What is it about Tolkien that speaks to you and your subject area? I mean, as a teacher and now as a person with a doctorate, you used your love of Tolkien in your doctorate and your love of teaching. So what is it about these texts that speak to you and your subject area?
I kind of like to broaden that out sometimes when people ask, because I feel like for all of us, the books that we hold on to are the books that spoke to us in the right way at the right time.
Agreed.
And so for me, it happened to be that when I was in middle school, I was introduced to Tolkien, and just the ability to enter into that world imaginatively. And, I still remember, sitting in a classroom and rushing through a test so I would have time to read before everyone else finished the test, those kinds of things. And I just invested in that world so heavily that when I think about fantasy, that's the one I think about. And I am fully on board with people having that experience with other authors, and I think it's a wonderful thing. And what I love the most is when I find someone as passionate about another author as I am about Tolkien, and we can kind of compare notes. It's like, but what about this? I love this part. And they're like, yeah, he does that too, but my author does this and that. And it's one of the ways that I love most to kind of expand my own horizons is through someone's fandom of something else. I let them introduce me to something through their eyes, which is something that I love. And just realizing that that's an experience that I love is what makes me want to teach Tolkien. It is, if I can find something that I love and I'm passionate about, that makes it easier for me to convey that to my students, because your love as a teacher is always apparent. When I went through my undergraduate degree, one of my majors was in secondary education, and they always said, don't lie to your students because they can tell when you're lying.
Boy, can they.
Yeah, but they would also say, teach what you love because your students can tell. Which is highly ironic because I went through studying British literature and then promptly got a job in American literature. So it's like, yeah, I love this. I promise.
Sure.
So it was, I grew to love it over the several years that I taught it, but it was not second nature to me as much as British literature was at the time. But I think I keep coming back to Tolkien because there is so much depth there. I have found that as I grow up, I can keep exploring it in new and different ways. And sometimes it's a choice. Sometimes I can go in and say, okay, I'm going to read it and look for these things. But other times I just let the reading choose me. I just go in and I say, I just want to read it for fun and see what I pick up on. And I especially love reading it with students because each time they pick up on things that I never would have.
Yeah.
And that kind of goes back to my PhD quite a bit if you want me to transition to talking about that.
Sure.
So I realized one of the kind of groundworks I did for figuring out what I wanted to write my PhD on. Well, the backstory to that is I went to do my master's and people said, don't do Tolkien, you'll never get a job in Tolkien. So I did it in Beowulf and then realized I wouldn't get a job in Beowulf either. So I decided when I did my PhD, I would focus on what I actually am passionate about. And so part of my research for that was going back and figuring out what was my reading history of Tolkien like. And so I did this whole series where I went through and I found my old books, which had my margin notes for the first time I read the book, and just decoding those and remembering what I thought about certain things. And one of the big kind of changes for me from one reading to the next when I was younger was in my very first reading, I was very suspicious of everything. That's just kind of who I was as a kid as well. I was not very trusting. And so, in the Shire, Gandalf says, don't trust anybody. So as soon as we left the Shire, I didn't trust anybody. That included Tom Bombadil. And so
he's kind of shady.
Exactly.
Let's be honest.
Well, if you look at it, cut and dry, the hobbits are abducted by a tree.
Yeah.
This magical guy happens across them and lets them out, says, hey, come to my home. Hey, show me that ring. Hey, I'm going to play with the ring. Like there are a lot of elements here that are worrying.
Exactly. And to this day, we don't know who he is.
Right.
We don't get a clear answer in Tom Bombadil. So I think you were right. I think it's fair to be suspicious of Tom Bombadil.
So I didn't trust him until he put them on the path and left. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess he was just a good guy. But then later, like years and years later, reading that, like Tolkien was perhaps thinking that was going to be where a witch house was placed in his story. I was like, see, I knew it. I was just reading Tolkien's mind. That's what it was.
Exactly.
But that was my initial response to Tom, that I didn't really trust him. And then I realized, talking to other people, no one else seemed to have that interpretation of Tom. And then reading what people actually had written and how they saw him as like a nature spirit or a Maya, which I kind of thought was an angel at the time because I hadn't really read the Silmarillion or anything.
Yeah.
All these different theories, but they were all positive theories. I was like, oh, okay, I think I'll read it that way. Like, making the decision to change my mind to accept what kind of the general consensus was. So when it came time to write my PhD, I realized, I wonder how often that happens. I wonder how often we have kids in their first reading think certain things, but as they're exposed to more information and more context, their mind changes. And so I decided I wanted to interview young readers under the age of 18, about their interpretation of The Lord of the Rings. And so that's what my study really focused on. And it became kind of part literature study and part sociology study, where because it's through the university, it had to go through a very rigorous process of going through the IRB board, internal review board,
Right.
and getting permissions because I'm using human subjects, quote unquote, and all this kind of stuff. So it really had to be diving deep into figure out, okay, how do you phrase questions? How do you make sure you're not giving a biased response? Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But we ended up with some really interesting takeaways from that, and one of the most fun things for me was just having the opportunity to one-on-one sit down with a whole bunch of kids and just talk to them about what they thought of the Lord of the Rings, and not teaching them, just
Yeah.
listening and asking questions and letting them explore and letting them explain and letting them tell me what they thought of the text was just such a fun experience. Then I had to do the real work of writing it all down.
Yeah, that's the hard part, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I love that. And it's absolutely fascinating just what goes into this kind of study and what kids get out of these stories. I mean, your interpretation, your initial interpretation of Tom Bombadil rings true for me, because when you go into the woods in a fairy tale, that's the scary part. I just immediately thinking of Hansel and Gretel, like the witch with the candy house. Like, why wouldn't you be suspicious of Tom Bombadil? This cultural idea had an impact on you. And, where do other kids from other cultures, other demographics, other stories get these ideas? So when I heard that you'd done this PhD, I thought, yes, this is my kind of thing. This is brilliant. This is perfect. And so to clarify a little bit more, when I first heard about your PhD, it was because it was, working with kids and working, I knew you were a teacher and that you taught kids. You had to merge the requirements of, being a teacher and working with kids to the requirements of a literature study. You talked a little bit about it before, but like, how did you manage to bring those two together? And also, I want to mention, you had Dr. Dimitra Fimi as your advisor. How cool was that? Side question.
It was very cool. It's honestly, it's one of the most fortunate thing that's ever happened to me in my life. Just that she agreed to do it, I'm still blown away by. And you cannot ask for a better mentor and a better supporter as you're working through something like this, because it's tough. But she was diligent, and she was very supportive, and it wouldn't have happened without her. I say with no reservations whatsoever. So yes, all praise to Dimitra Fimi. But the other question that you mentioned, I found that really what I had to do in these interviews was to fight my impulse to teach, really. In that, in a lot of ways, well, something I've always fought against in myself is that I don't like the teaching style where I'm the authority in the room. That's not the approach that I prefer. I prefer to be the aid or the guide approach, where we have computers, let me help you find what you want to find in order to do what you want to do, that kind of thing.
Right.
Or we have to write this kind of essay, let me give you help to figure out how you get there from where you are, those kinds of things. And I found that approach worked better with interviewing, because as opposed to kind of directing them in their responses, instead it's more of asking probing questions to dig them deeper into their own understanding, which there's an old saying from Tolkien that the journey in is also the journey up. But also I find that the journey in is also the journey into knowledge. If you know yourself and you know your own interpretations and understandings better, you begin to understand why you have those interpretations, and then that can help you in the future, because you know how you develop your interpretations, and you can analyze things a bit better.
Yeah.
So really, that's where I felt the overlap the most in this study was, how do I help students develop their own thoughts without kind of intruding with my own thoughts. Because one of the easiest things in the world to do as a teacher is to give examples. And we don't realize how often when we give examples, what we're saying is, I want you to read it like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so just finding those tendencies within myself and learning really how to do, a more structured interview in a way to avoid inserting my own bias was really helpful in that.
And I imagine you had to really think about the questions that you asked your students, because I know there are times when I construct a question and I realize that the way that I ask the question is leading them into an answer. And that's,
Mhm.
I can imagine that's not something you wanted in your study.
Yeah, very much had to put a whole lot of work into the phrasing of the questions. As a teacher, sometimes we want to lead them to the answer, right? If no one's
Sometimes, yeah.
answered for 2 minutes, we're like, okay, do you think this is the answer? Like,
Wink, wink.
but that was a very helpful experience, because now I think about it when I create things like essay questions. How do I phrase it in a way that allows them as much room to explore as I want them to have? Because even with the most open-ended essay question, I'm still pointing them in a direction, but I
Yeah.
want to give them as much room to play within that direction as I can, while still getting something ultimately gradable, unfortunately. But
Yeah, that's the problem with these tests is they have to be gradable. They have to stick with the rubric, don't they?
so that was a really helpful experience to me, just learning how to not intrude on their thought process with my own opinions and thoughts.
Mhm.
um, yeah, absolutely. And that bled over into my text project, the Tolkien Experience project, because I came up with 5 questions that anyone could answer. And it's so funny how many times I get the response, these questions are so simple. Like, just be like, they think that it was easy to come up with the questions. I'm like, actually, they took a lot of thought and a lot of deliberation to make sure I'm not saying, like, you know, something that will lead to certain answers. And I
Yeah.
think that's why we've had such a range of responses that we have had to that project, because the questions are so open-ended there.
Yeah. So, what were some of the results of your PhD study? What did you notice that children specifically see? I know you talked about Tolkien Experience Project a bit, so that's geared primarily towards adults and their experiences. So they've had a wealth of experiences with Tolkien, whether it's here's what I learned as a kid, here's how I first experienced it, here's how I'm experiencing it now. But with
Mhm.
kids, it's that initial idea, it's that initial exposure. So, what did you notice that children see and enjoy about Tolkien? And how did they connect with his stories?
So one of the most interesting things was, we had a question about the genre of the Lord of the Rings. Like,
Mhm.
what other books would they group it with? And we had no majority response on that.
Really?
We had a plurality. About a third of the participants said it was fantasy, but then there were several other very close contenders for that. And then we had a question asking, that question provided, I think it was 10 different options for them to choose. And then we had a follow-up that was just an open-ended, why did you choose the response that you chose the previous question?
Mhm.
Um, and the most fascinating thing was that really there were 2 different impulses that the kids used. One was kind of the one that I ascribe to most kind of like editors, publishers. They chose the biggest element in the book and they used that to classify it. So, like, if they thought the destroying the ring was the biggest element, they classified it as a quest story, that kind of
Ah,
thing. Um, but the other impulse that I thought was fascinating was kids just chose the genre that they thought was the biggest, the one that they thought could contain the most things within it, because they just saw the story as so big, so encompassing, that they
yeah.
wanted to find the word out of that genre list that could cover as much ground as they could. And so
Hmm.
for some of them, that was fantasy. For others of them, it was a war story. For others, it was a journey. Some of them chose quest for that as well. For some of them, they called it an epic. So it just depended very much on what they thought was most important to do when they tried to label the book, to try and focus
Yeah.
on what's most important or to try and capture the entire essence.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really cool.
That is really cool. Thank goodness, because they should get a job in publishing, because clearly, like, because it's so easy for publishers to try and they're like, oh, this has a teensy bit of this magical element, bloop, gonna put that in that category. But there's so much, and there's so many layers, and it's clear to me from what you just said that they considered all of those layers.
Yeah, and part of my literature review for this was looking into what age was really appropriate and what age can kind of make these kinds of distinctions, and so we ended up, our youngest participant, I believe, was 7. But we know that kids as young as the age of 5 can determine fantasy from reality without any prompting whatsoever. And it's inconclusive which kids can do it at a younger age because of the way that testing is done. But we know that by 5 they can. And so that was another really interesting perspective, in that, some of the genres that they chose, like war story, could be a realistic story, but the way they described it very much was, to them, the war story could encompass the most important elements, but also the traveling, the adventure, the conflicts, the negotiations, all those kinds of things that they were seeing as well. So it was fascinating that this age range was still picking such a wide range of things, even though they know it's a fantasy. It's not realistic, I should say.
Right. It's, the publisher says it's a fantasy. There's some magical elements in it. But, we often say, like, yes, this is a war story, or this is a story about people. It's just, it's all of these things. And clearly the kids are able to see that.
I kind of put the cat among the pigeons when I talk about this, because one of the most kind of, lots of different scholars throughout time have tried to define fantasy, and how do we determine what's fantasy and what's not. And one of the most popular ones to use right now is Brian Atterbury has his idea of the fuzzy set.
Yes.
Which is, you have some seminal works at the middle of fantasy, and then the things are kind of more or less fantasy depending on how close they are, and then the boundaries are always kind of fuzzy.
Yeah.
Well, one of his pillar texts is The Lord of the Rings. And the way that he determined this was he sent out a survey to some of his colleagues who study literature.
Yeah.
And that was kind of what they said. But my kind of pushback to that is, who gets to determine what the standard texts are? Is it the people like us who kind of sit in academia, or is it the people in the world?
Right.
And my sample group is larger than his sample group. So if my sample group can't agree, granted they are children, I understand that, but who's the one making the decisions about what they want to buy, what they want to read, those kinds of things? I think we have to weigh them equally. And so then the question becomes, if we can't all agree that The Lord of the Rings is a fantasy book, then does the genre have meaning to our readers at all?
Right.
I don't have an answer to that question, but
another PhD study.
Yeah, there you go. It's your turn. Go for it.
Exactly. Hey kids, what genre? Let's just upend the entirety of the publishing industry and just forget about genre entirely.
Yeah, I apologize to all marketers.
Yeah, I do. Oh, that's wonderful though, because it really is. It's funny to see. You've got the ivory tower concept, and then you have the consumer concept. And where do these kids lie on that spectrum? You have books that we introduce to them because we, the adults, have vetted them and have looked at them and determined this is classical literature. And then you have the other ones that are vetted through a curriculum or vetted through the teacher's love. So that's the schema that we're building with them too.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I came across was this concept of cross reading,
Mhm.
where we call it a book that crosses over if an adult will also read a children's book. So like the crossover novel is something that was considered a YA when it was published, actually also has an adult audience.
Mhm.
But the funny thing is we never call it crossover when it goes the opposite way. If it's something published as an adult book, but kids also read it. And the argument for that is kids have always read adult books. Like if we look at what we
Yeah.
consider great classics now, like Robinson Crusoe, kids read that when it was published. If we look at like Piers Plowman, that was read to kids when it was published because it was a morality tale. Um,
That's true.
so I think we don't have a term for it because it happens all the time.
Yeah.
and,
I
and
mean,
so I think we have this kind of weird um, need to kind of cordon off what we deem to be childish to preserve really the adults more than the children, to kind of go back to what you were talking about we determine the frames that kids have for reading. I think I don't have a problem with classifying things as children's literature or YA literature for the sake of clarity about who the intended audience for the author is or something like
mhm.
that. I don't particularly care about the intent of the publisher. Sorry. But I think also we need to be careful that we don't pigeonhole our young readers into only letting them read those books.
For
Um,
sure.
that's not to say that caregivers shouldn't have a say in what their children read. Obviously, they should, but I don't think we can, as a society, say these are the young adult books and these are the children's books, and they can read nothing but those.
Yeah.
Because I think that limits our readers.
Agreed. Agreed. And that's something that I fully believe in. I do not want to limit my students in any way. Like I tell my students, like, give it a try. If you have to put it down, you have to put it down, but give it a try first.
Yeah,
As a
and
reading specialist, I'm constantly getting these like messages like, what kinds of books are good for struggling readers and what kinds of books are not. But they know what works.
yeah, a book that they'll read is good for a struggling reader. Like,
Thank you. Yes. I have proof. I have a picture of two of my boys who refuse to read all year. They're reading the Chronicles of Narnia.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah, and I think, sorry to derail
No,
the conversation even further.
do it.
I
Derail
think
away.
that there are. I have a lot of opinions about education, and I one of them is that I think that we undervalue texts and overvalue uh, critical thinking in some circumstances.
Mhm.
So, for instance, back when I taught high school, um, one of our units was on the Declaration of Independence. Um, and I went up to my principal because the requirements for that lesson said nothing about appreciating the social context of the Declaration of Independence. Instead, they
Mhm.
wanted us to talk about the persuasive elements of it.
Which is
Like,
cool, but
yeah, we
it's an
can,
older text.
yeah, we can do that. And the unit for the Declaration of Independence was one day. So it's like, okay, so we're going to read this part of it and we're going to talk about persuasive elements and then we're going to move on. And we're not going to talk about the fact that it's the Declaration of Independence. And so that's what I'm saying, is that texts are a cultural artifact and we need to understand that they do have relevance to the time in which they're written, but they also have relevance to us individually at the time that we read them.
Mhm.
And so having those conversations, I think, is just as important, particularly when you're dealing with a student who doesn't see the importance of the work.
Mhm.
If my answer to him is it's important because we can figure out how to do persuasive elements, that's not going to get him to read it. But
No.
if I can say, this text was important for us as a country to be here right now, and it might be important to you as you're trying to form your own opinions, both as an individual and as someone with political agency, you might want to know about this stuff. And if we can
Agreed.
have that conversation, that's a lot more enticing to them than here, let's get the curriculum out of the way.
Yeah. If I want to teach persuasion, I'll use an advertisement.
Yep.
I'll
use a Super Bowl commercial.
There you go. Exactly. Because that cultural relevance, and it's quick, that takes one day.
Mm-hmm.
But no, Declaration of Independence, that takes a lot more than one day.
Oh, we loved Super Bowl commercial time when I was a teacher in high school. We'd spend a couple days just looking at all the commercials and talking about pathos, ethos, logos. What are they doing right? What are they doing wrong?
Yep.
Oh yeah.
Hit me with that little puppy with the horses for the Budweiser commercial. I am a bawling mess. I don't even drink beer. I don't even drink beer. I will buy Budweiser 100% because of that puppy. It's all about the puppy. Anyway, we digress.
It's a trait with Tolkien podcasts. So we have to endorse it.
Indeed. And Alan and Sean in the Prancy Pony, they have to trademark it. Every time we digress, we have to give them $5. So what advice would you give to other teachers or other people who read your dissertation? I know it's up on academia.edu. So if somebody were, I believe, right, it's up on.
It's not there. It's through the basically since I did it at a UK institution, it has to be made publicly available. So it's available through their institution. But if you just Google it, it comes up because it's open access. It's Small Hands Do Them Because They Must, and it's interpretations of The Lord of the Rings by young readers.
Small Hands Do Them Because They Must. I love that title. It's a beautiful title.
It's a nod to Tolkien, of course, and
of course,
very much chosen because we're dealing with children, but also because fine, no one else is going to do this study. I guess I'll do it, and and
why not?
Very overwhelming at the moment, so I was like,
I'll bet
Small Hands too. So there you go.
There you go. And now it's a tool that I'm going to use in my teaching, and I'm sure other teachers might as well. So what practices, activities, adaptations could teachers make in order to support their students in reading Tolkien, whether it's a first read or a reread? How would you recommend others read or use your dissertation for that element?
So I think there are kind of two different things that teachers can take away from it. The first is the expansiveness with which we can anticipate the readers responding. They're going to have a lot of opinions, a lot of very wide and diverse opinions. And if we can foster that rather than funneling that, it will lead to a lot of great interactive things like discussion groups and those kinds of things. Not to say that we can't funnel that into an essay if we need to, but I think giving them a series of open-ended questions, exploration style questions would really be a very fruitful way to approach Tolkien with a younger reader. The other thing is that because I was conducting interviews one-on-one, I did lean into some teaching methodology for allowing students to engage deeper. And I can actually recommend some of those because that found them very helpful. The first is it's called a diamond ranking activity, where you have a diamond of 9 squares, one on top, then a row of 2, then a row of 3, then a row of 2, and then a row of 1. So you end up with 9. And the thought behind this is you have the student maybe cut out little slips, or maybe print off slips for them, something they can manipulate. And you have them put their favorite or the strongest character or the best character or some kind of vague subjective measurement at the top, and then the 2 next favorite or 2 next best, and then the 3 in the middle, and then 2 almost least favorite, and then 1 least favorite, or evil list, or we want to ask a question in a way that has room, because what we're most interested in with this is not their ranking, but their explanation. Why is this character your favorite? Why did you put them at the top? And that leaves them a lot of rooms to explore. So naturally, because it's 9 spaces, we did this with the fellowship. And so we had a lot of variation. The characters that were the favorite were actually Gandalf and Sam.
Yep, gotta be
and
Sam.
and believe it or not, Legolas came swooping in there.
Interesting.
The other thing the one thing I cannot quite understand is that far and away the character placed in a certain position most frequently is Aragorn was placed in that second row by almost everyone.
So not the favorite, but
right. But he's
almost there.
Yeah, he's almost favorite for everyone.
Okay.
Like a couple people placed him as favorite, but like I would say like 26, 27 out of 30 put him as second favorite.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And so that's something I definitely want to explore in future unpacking of the data, why that happened. I mean, I don't disagree with it. I'll be honest.
Right.
Like I think Pippin's favorite for me, and then probably Aragorn.
Yeah. But what is it about Aragorn that, or is it a question of like, is it because is Aragorn the reason why he's in that second ranking, or is it just that somebody else is better for us? Like there's always like, is there just one other character that just does it for? Ooh, this is a This is a fascinating question.
I have theories, but they will take hours. So let's
of course.
So this is a really, really, really helpful strategy if you're trying to get students to do brainstorming for something, because having them rank and then having those open-ended questions about why did you pick this, why did you pick that, allows them to develop their thoughts in bulk. They can give you like a paragraph explanation about why this character is better than that character, or why this character is more personable or relatable, or those kinds of things. So I found that a very helpful activity. And because most of my interviews happened online, I actually had a PDF slide that had the diamond on it, and then I had made little text boxes with the name, so I could just carry the name over and put it wherever they wanted it to be in the thing. So it's actually something you can do online as well, and it works very well.
Brilliant.
The other activity that I used was focused on the settings of the Lord of the Rings. You could also do it really anytime you want to better understand the way that your students are visualizing something in their head, in their mind. And what it was I had 5 different settings: the Shire, Rivendell, Lothlorien, Bree, Moria. And for each one, I had a primary set of 4 pictures. And so they would pick which one of those 4 pictures most reminded them of the setting, and then we would talk about it. We would say, okay, why did you pick this picture? What is it in the picture that reminds you of the setting? And then you can also do comparative. Like, why did you pick this picture instead of this one? Why did you not like this picture? Those kinds of things, which led to a lot of discussion. And then the kind of novel part of this activity was that each of those pictures from what I call the primary set is related to another set, a subset. So for instance, if in the Shire, a lot of the participants picked a kind of a field that had a couple copse of trees. And actually one of them used the word copse, and it made me so happy. But with that, the subset was several different kinds of meadows. One that was more of a rolling hill, one that had kind of a tree line at the end, one that was kind of in the fall, so kind of browned, and also one that had like a river border on it.
Okay.
So just very widely ranging. And the purpose isn't to like nail down, oh, they picked it because of that or because that's what the discussion is for. Again, we're more interested in the discussion. And so it's like, okay, if you pick the first one because it's a meadow, okay, let's get into more information about why you picked the meadow. So which one of these do you like the best and why? So it makes them go even further than they did on the first one. And so I found that really, really helpful and really, really engaging because it's so visual. Like I said, most of these were online interviews, and so I would have kids like crawling up close to the screen to like get a really good peek at the pictures and ask me where the pictures come from.
Yeah.
And of course, at the end, I think one of my favorite questions was, if you could change one thing about this picture to make it look more like the setting, what would you change? And I got so many fascinating responses to that. From they would add platforms in the trees to make it look more like Lothlorien, to the meadow needed more hills because that's where the hobbits would live. Those kinds of answers that they would. I'm not prompting them to do any of this. This is just their pure imagination, and it was just a
Yeah.
joy to ask that question every time.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. And the fact that they brought the textual elements into that image,
Hmm.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I think, I love it. And I gotta say, I've had a similar response. Like I once showed a couple of my students were trying to figure out, why are they following Sauron? Like, why do these people actually listen to Sauron?
Mm.
And I had to tell them, like, you guys don't understand. Once upon a time ago, Sauron was really pretty. Like when he was Anatar, like he wasn't always this nebulous spirit. So I showed them an artist's rendering of Anatar, and they're like, so that's what he looks like? And I goes, well, that's one interpretation. And I showed them a bunch. I'd often show them different visuals of different parts, and they would say, that's not how I imagined it, or that's not how it is in Peter Jackson's films. So where are they getting these images, and where are they getting these ideas? It's just amazing what goes in their brain, what goes on in their brains. And I love that. Sounds like a fantastic activity.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And I have a book recommendation for you when we're done, because I'll have to look it up.
Okay. Good. Yay. Yay for book recommendations, as if my shelf isn't full enough.
Oh, but you'll love it because it's oh gosh, I can't remember what her title is, but she studies young readers, and this is like a whole book that she's written just about her own two kids reading different books, and it's wonderful. Brilliant.
All right, let's get to the Tolkien Experience podcast. I know this question is a little what you studied in your PhD and what you interviewed in your PhD is a bit different, but you're still looking a bit at reception theory in that you studied the reception of that kids had with Tolkien, and now with the Tolkien Experience podcast, you're looking at it with adults. So what are some of the insights, answers that your subjects have shared in the Tolkien Experience podcast that have really caught your attention?
Yeah, it's really interesting the way that these two things kind of grew at the same time. So like I said, the way that I had to study to make the questions for the PhD definitely informed the ways that I wrote these questions. And the other way that this worked was when I was trying to recruit younger readers to be in the PhD, I often had people get upset that they couldn't participate because they were too old.
Yep.
And so I really always felt bad saying like, no, I'm sorry you can't participate, because I felt like I was saying your interpretation isn't important. And I wanted to avoid that. So that's what led me to develop the project, which then turned into the podcast, because a lot of people were like, you should make this a podcast. I was like, okay, I'll try. And it's been such an amazing journey, because we have, since 2019, we've been gathering responses from people, and none of them are the same. Not one is like another, and it's just amazing. As much as I want to hold up specific interpretations that I think are amazing, what I really want to do is use this platform a little bit differently. I want to say that too often when I ask people to contribute, or I ask if they would want to, they say no, there's nothing special about mine. And my response to that is always, it's yours. That's what makes it special. Because no one reads the book the way you do. It's impossible for someone to read the book the way that you do, because you're a unique person. You've had your own experiences. You've come through things that no one else has. You've lived in different places. You've been in a different house.
Mhm.
You breathe different air than everyone
Yes.
else. And the fact that the book is important to you, of course you have a unique and interesting experience because you still love the book. If you didn't have that love, or if you didn't have a unique experience, you wouldn't still be thinking about the book at all. And so that's what I want to get out of the way first, is just let everyone know that whether they have a platform, whether they've ever talked about it, whether they've ever shared it with a family member, whether they've ever breathed a word about Tolkien out loud, their experience is unique and it's wonderful. And I applaud them for having read Tolkien. And I would love to hear about their experience. Okay, so now I can answer your question.
Sure.
I think that the things that fascinate me the most are the responses when someone talks about how they read the stories in an order that's not common. So, for
Mm.
instance, James Tauber of the Digital Tolkien domain, he read the appendices before he read anything else
Yep.
because his grandmother gave him the Return of the King as a present, and he realized it was a trilogy. So he's like, well, I can read the appendices without ruining everything. So he read those first. I think he read those, then the Silmarillion, and then later on came back to the more popular texts.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So like those kinds of stories I find fascinating because I always want to ask, okay, so how do you think that changed your interpretation? What did you think about this or that? A lot of people seem to think that there's a lot of difference between those who watched the films first versus read the books first. I haven't found that to be true.
Yeah.
Like they're more likely to still have an appreciation for the films than people who read the books and then maybe were disappointed by the films. But I have found that if they like the films enough to go and explore the books, they hold an appreciation for the differences.
Hmm.
And if anything, the movies influenced their visualization of the books, but didn't change their appreciation for things like the depth of character, the way that the descriptions of sceneries and things like that are different. So that I think that's been interesting to me, just to see how little the films change people's interpretation of the book, even if they still love the film. I think that's been really important as well. And I think the last one that stands out to me is I asked this throwaway question. Well, it's meant to be kind of sneaky. So the last question is, would you recommend Tolkien? Why or why not? And everyone goes, of course I'll recommend Tolkien. But then they have to figure out why or why not.
Right.
That's the trap.
Yes, it is.
Well, welcome to being a teacher.
I mean, I remember I thought really hard about how I answered that question because I'm thinking to myself, as a teacher, who am I recommending it to?
Hmm. Yeah.
But yes,
And
great question.
it's that simple, you know, it's the type of question that teachers get harangued for being lazy, like just the why or why not there at the end. Like you didn't even put thought into this question, but it's like, but I
Excuse
did
me.
because because now you have to do a lot of the work.
Yeah. You got to use your brain.
Yeah, and I've gotten some really really fascinating responses to that one, particularly from Berlin Flieger in her podcast with Sarah Brown. She was saying that she realized that she doesn't recommend Tolkien, like in practice. So in theory, she loves Tolkien, but she in fact does not recommend Tolkien very often. And a follow on from that, my good friend Eric Mueller Harder, when I interviewed him, said the same thing. After he listened to Verlin, he was saying, in fact, I don't recommend Tolkien very often either, because he's either around people that know very much that he's into Tolkien, and it's kind of pointless to recommend him at that point because everyone knows you would recommend him, or he's in a situation where it's not really the kind of place to recommend something.
Mm.
Um, and so he just says, as a practical matter, he ends up not recommending Tolkien very much. So I thought that those were really insightful responses, more considered responses to that question. So yeah, those are three things that I think have been really illuminating for me.
That is fascinating. It is interesting to think about because that's Verlin Flieger. You would think she would recommend it.
Mhm.
It is her job. It is what she does. It is she looks at Tolkien. She looks at Frodo. She wouldn't recommend it. I mean, wow. It's but
Yeah.
I can see it for sure.
Mhm.
In your opinion, what is the value of fantasy, especially for children? Why should fantasy be taught in schools at all?
So I'm a big fan. I'm gonna give a shout out, and it's gonna be somewhat educationally political. I'm a big fan of this thinker named Sir Ken Robinson. Um,
Yes.
One of his uh, kind of sound bites is that we don't teach creativity in schools the same way that we teach reading and writing.
Mhm.
Why? Why not? Um, and I feel that very strongly. That one of the things that we have to do as teachers is prepare our students to live a life 20 years from when we have them, 30 years from when we have them, so on. If they're lucky, a good 80 years from when we have them.
Knock on wood, for sure.
But I think that teaching them to enjoy things is part of that, and especially to enjoy things that are simple, but in a way revolutionary and countercultural at this point in time. To say, I'm not going to sit on the computer, instead I'm going to go sit and read a book, is not what you think of a typical teenager doing at this
Mhm.
point in time. And so it really is an uphill battle in a lot of ways to engage with students in something that seems so mundane, seems so dated or antiquated. And I think that first off, we need to use all the tools available to us. So that includes, if they love fantasy, sure, give them fantasy. Like,
Mhm.
I'm not gonna, if I can get them to read, I want them to read, no matter what it is. And so that's
Amen.
that's part of it. But the other part is that I'm gonna group fantasy and science fiction together for a minute. I think that both of these genres have a unique way to speak to our current conditions in a way that can avoid knee-jerk reactions. They have a way of talking about the way that we act, or the way that we treat others, or the way that we um, explore the world around us in a way that allows us to let our guard down and to truly listen and hear. I can One of the texts that I recommend to every student I have is Ursula Le Guin's foreword to Left Hand of Darkness, where she talks about, science fiction is also stereotyped as an extrapolation. Let's look at a piece of science that we have now and project that being super important in the future, and how would that affect things. And she says, no, it's not. That's not what science fiction is. Science fiction is a metaphor for the way the world is now. It's a super impactful text, and it's only like 10 pages. So I make everyone read it. But just, she's absolutely right. Science fiction and fantasy have a way of speaking to us where we are right now that makes us listen. It's like how any good politician tells a story rather than just argues,
Mhm.
because the story can make you understand something better than just the bullet points of their fact. And so I think that's why fantasy deserves a place in our education, because that's what allows us to be more human in a way. Way back when I was, a young 20 something, I I would always make the overly general and somewhat scathing comment that math and science tells us how. How
Mhm.
does stuff work? Uh, how does the world keep spinning? How do we build things? How do we understand things? The arts gives us the why. Why do we want to live? Why do we want to reach out and talk to people? Why do we want to be in community? Why is this life worth living?
Mm-hmm.
And I think fantasy has some of the most poignant answers to that question. Certainly, I think we have some really huge titans in nonfiction literature who have amazing answers to that question. But I think the way that fantasy can engage with that question through story is uniquely powerful. So that's why I think we need it in education.
Agreed.
Sorry,
Really?
that was
No, that was a
blustery.
brilliant answer. Like you saw me, like I'm sitting here, I'm nodding, I'm agreeing with every single word that you said. So please, I'm all for it. All right, I'm gonna throw a lightning round question at you. All right,
Okay.
You ready for this?
Okay.
If you could have any teacher / mentor figure from any fantasy, science fiction, popular culture, novel, movie, etc., who would it be? Who would you want to be your teacher?
Do they have to be a teacher in the book, or can I just make them my teacher?
Let's go with the latter. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's broaden the question, but yeah, go with it. Go for it. Yeah, teacher is a very broad. That's why I added mentor figure. So very broad definition.
Oh gosh.
Right. I'm a little evil for throwing this at you, I know, but I love hearing the answer to this question.
This is when you're going to have to edit down the silence.
That's all right. That's what technology is for.
So it's so hard to pick just one. And at the same time, it's also hard to remember all of the ones I would like to pick.
Yeah.
So I think number one would probably have to be Gandalf. But Gandalf the Grey, not Gandalf the White. And maybe even Gandalf from The Hobbit, not Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. Because Gandalf kind of loses some of his humor as he goes, and it's his humor that I love the most.
Yeah.
When he leaves the Shire in the beginning of Lord of the Rings and says, keep an eye open for me, especially at unexpected times. And it's like, what? But who's not expecting? Like, no one's expecting you at any time except for me, so it would be my unexpected times. How is this possible, Gandalf?
Come on, Gandalf. Let's go, buddy.
So I think I have to go with him first. Oddly enough, if it's like a strict teacher person, I think Mrs. Frizzle from Magic School Bus. Because just like a teacher who can actually take you on field trips to explore anything and just like seems to have absolutely no ability to shut kids down when they're trying their best is just a magical trait as a teacher.
Indeed.
And then to finish it off, I would probably put like, I almost want to say like one of the teachers from Community. Like,
okay.
Yeah, I don't know. It's weird. Because the other ones are just so serious. And that one, I like.
You got to have some humor in the classroom.
Yeah, maybe John Oliver's character from Community. He just, because in like the third or fourth season, he just shows up and he's like, all right, we're learning today. What are we learning? Someone tell me what we're learning. And and then they just do it as a class. I think it was anthropology. He didn't have any background in, so they just kind of made it up as they went.
What does that say about anthropology?
Well, he was in psychology, and so he randomly got assigned to an anthropology class.
That'll do it then. Yeah. Poor guy. Oh, how many of us have been thrown into a subject that we had?
Gosh.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Like, hey, you kind of have background in this particular subject. You're going to teach it. Okay, I'll try, but don't. Yeah, don't put me in a math classroom. I'm in trouble.
Yeah. Or if you taught where I taught, hey, you studied British literature and you've been doing American literature for 2 years for us. Why don't you pick up a couple world literature classes? Okay, I guess I'll teach Julius Caesar. Okay.
Great. Sure. Why not? Oy, oy, oy. It's true. They don't pay teachers enough for that nonsense. Before we say goodbye, do you have any projects or publications in progress that you'd like to share?
I am working on some publications, but can't share much about that right now.
Well, phooey. But when you can.
Yeah. But other than those things, of course, I'm working through the Tolkien Experience podcast. We've kind of slowed down recently for a number of life event reasons, but we are still publishing, coming out hopefully once a month right now. And then, of course, I'm the editor of Maloran, the Journal of the Tolkien Society. So if you are curious about that, the easiest way to look into that is if you Google Maloran, we actually have a website where we have all of our issues are open access except for the most recent 2 years. And then if that's interesting enough to you, you can always join the Tolkien Society and get access to the newest stuff.
Highly recommend being a member of the Tolkien Society. Very worth it. Luke, thank you so much. I heartily appreciate you coming to talk to me today about teaching Tolkien. And thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's been a real pleasure.
Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your other favorite podcast feeds. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a rating and a review as well. You can read and find out more about Teaching with Magic by visiting our website, teachingwithmagic.blog. You can leave a message on our podcast page, read past Teaching with Magic posts, and check out our book lists on our affiliate page. We also invite you to support us on Patreon. You'll have access to bonus material, our Discord channel, live Q&As, and you'll get a sneak peek at future products such as lesson plans, worksheets, and other teaching tools. The link is always available in our show notes and the podcast page on our website. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, keep making magic.